is Hard Pass, an analysis of press coverage of the top political story of the day. White House correspondent Brian Karem and university journalism professors Dr. Michael Mirer and Dr. Mark Mederson host Hard Pass. In this first introductory episode, the team will tell you about who they are and what the show is about. Gentlemen?
I'm Mark Mederson. Welcome to Hard Pass. A lot has happened since Donald Trump was sworn in for his second term as president. So much seems to be happening daily that can be hard to understand just exactly what is going on. Trump, of course, is not a traditional president, and even though this is his second go-around, the media, and in particular the corporate media, seem to be having a difficult time with how to report on this president and his administration. For many people who want to have a better understanding of just exactly what is happening, they may be unsure about where to get good, credible information, and that's where we come in. Hard Pass is an effort to help you get a better understanding of what is happening based on how media are covering it. First, for those who may not know, for reporters who work in media, there are two types of media credential. The soft pass is the temporary pass, which is literally like a paper pass. It allows a reporter to cover something one time. And a hard pass is a more permanent and comprehensive pass, literally laminated or on hard plastic. And this is what the name of our show is derived from. Now let's meet our team. First up, Brian Karem. Brian, tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm a poor, humble country boy from Kentucky. I'm a White House reporter, have been off and on since the Reagan era and currently hold a hard pass, but we'll see how long that lasts. And I have, as I said, covered every president since Reagan, have been thrown in jail 4 times to protect a confidential source, fought and defeated Donald Trump in court 3 times to keep my hard pass during his last administration, and have covered conflicts and wars in several continents and 15 countries.
Excellent. And I think as we go on throughout our episodes, we'd like to hear some more about this experience that you've had with trying to protect sources and what that means to you. Maybe we could do that as a sidebar at some point. So Mike, Dr. Mirer, let's hear about you.
Yeah, so I am the only hard pass I've ever had was with the Sacramento Kings. I had to cover them as a beat writer for the Davis Enterprise in California. So I'm a professor of communication officially, although I teach primarily journalism here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Go Milwaukee, I guess. And we are, so I've been, I was a sports reporter, journalist for 6 years in New Mexico and California. Got out right as the financial crisis hit in 2008. Did grad school. Shared an office with you, Mark, I believe, a couple times, and now I'm teaching at UW Milwaukee.
And that's something we learned as we prepared for this program today, is that we all had experience working in sports, and while some people may decide that makes us somewhat less credible. As we talked about on our own, politics and sports are pretty similar when it comes to how they're covered and how they're reported on. There's a winner and a loser oftentimes. And as you've heard often, this term horse race coverage, which comes from sports. So now that you know who we are, let's discuss what we think this podcast is going to be about. First, it's not an effort to break stories or offer opinions on national politics. Where we will offer our opinions based on our education and our experience, we'll be analyzing how well we think media are reporting on national politics and at times this administration. Brian, based on and I've got 2 question marks here, number of years of experience working as a White House correspondent, and if you lead off telling us exactly how many years that is, what do you hope to bring to these discussions on how the press is covering the current administration? What do you hope this podcast can bring to an audience?
Well, I hope that we can enlighten and illuminate what it is to be a reporter, and the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and vetted factual information. I have covered every president, like I said, since Ronald Reagan. With pride, I will say I have pissed off every president and every press secretary I've ever covered, Democrat or Republican, and rightly so, they deserved it. The the thing that we have to realize today, vetted factual information is still the coin of the realm. And until, we embrace what our true mission is, we will continue to have problems because there are people who will stay within their own informational silos. And and on this, I'm talking Democrats and Republicans stay within their own, silos and argue stuff. And half the time they're just flat wrong. They don't have the facts right, but they are convinced in the righteousness of their cause. So they continue to fight even though they don't know what it is they're talking about. And that's the fault of the press. We used to be trusted a lot more. You can blame every president since Ronald Reagan for some of this problem, and I do. But at the end of the day, I agree with H.L. Mencken, who once said the real question is the proximate man. It's the one who's in the White House. It's the one that's covering the story. Or as Ben Bagdikian said, and I love this, he was a mentor of mine, and he was a former editor at the Washington Post. He said, quote, "Never forget that your obligation is to the people. It is not at heart to those who pay you, or to your editor, or to your sources, or to your friends, or to the advancement of your career. It is to the public." Now, that's an ideal we should continue to strive for, and it's an ideal sorely lacking among most of the members of corporate media today.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in our first episode, this idea of corporate media. And I just realized I didn't really do a very good job of introducing myself. I'm Mark Mederson, Ph.D. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where Mike and I met. And as he said, we did share an office twice while we were studying for our PhD there. I taught at a small liberal arts college after I got my PhD, and then got a job here at Texas State University. I'm actually in the control room of our TV studio where I teach video production classes in sports broadcasting because I worked in sports for a number of years, starting in Huntsville, Alabama, covering college sports there, was fortunate enough to cover a college football national championship there, and then went back to Dallas where I covered the Cowboys and professional sports in Dallas for a number of years before going back to school and getting a master's and a PhD. Brian, I'm going to jump back to you because there's one thing I've seen you talk about a lot on your social media. You often posted pictures when you were granted access to the White House press briefing room talking about the soup. What does that mean? What is the soup?
Well, welcome back to the soup. First of all, it is humid as hell in Washington, D.C. So part of it is just soupy. I mean, it could be 80 degrees and it'll feel like it's 120 and you're going to melt. And by the way, for people who don't know, that the Rose Garden, where we often sit and meet the president, I don't care if it's midnight on December 21st, it's always sunny and 180 degrees in damn Rose Garden. It is never, and that's always soupy. The other part of the soup is, of course, more metaphorical, and it's just the soupiness of all the BS that you have to put up with in covering any White House. And that's, like I said, any and all White House. The problem is, another one of my mentors who I love to death and I still stay in touch with today is Sam Donaldson. And Sam, said, look, I don't mind that they're trying to put their best foot forward. What we should be doing in the press is trying to decipher it and tell people what's really going on. So the soup is wading through that, the miasma and the turgid miasma of the blarney that you're going to hear from any member of the executive branch or judiciary branch or legislative branch in Washington, D.C. They all have an agenda. They're all about themselves, and we're the guys that are supposed to be there calling balls and strikes and not siding with either or.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And Mike, even though Brian went to the University of Missouri, and we're not going to hold that against him being from...
Oh, well, you know how we are at the University of Missouri. We think that nobody exists but us, and the rest of you are mere pikers.
They have a journalism school at Missouri. I don't. No one's ever said
only
anything about
the finest journalism school in the country.
No one's ever said anything about that, so I've never heard.
Yeah, we won't get. Well, that will probably be a constant bone of contention throughout episodes, especially once the football season begins. So, Mike, what do you hope that we can do with this podcast? What we can do to help the audience have a better understanding of journalists covering this president, and particularly determining if there's sources for news, not just on this administration and not just on national politics, but how the people can seek out and determine where they can get credible information.
Right. So I think the challenge today and the thing that looks so different, right? Before we were recording, right, we were talking about all the old TV anchors who we sort of remembered. It was like remembering guys for TV anchors, and news used to be sort of a simpler process, right? It used to be a case where there were just a few people who owned newspapers and a few television stations, and the information was sort of simplified. The information system was very simple, because it went not that the work was easy, but that it was simple to sort of find your news, and we weren't bombarded with anything. We live in a world now where the media system is, what we call hybrid, right? Everybody is talking along the same pipes. The New York Times, I'm getting through the same phone as I'm getting from a lousy opinionated lying blog, right? They're both coming to me through the same place. All that information is mixed up together, and it's really a challenge for people to make sense of it, right? And we're not going back to an old system, right? So really, I think the challenge for people like me who study journalism, and the challenge for journalists, is to sort of be able to make sense of what we do now. Right? We don't have these sort of same trappings of authority that we used to have. We're not, journalism is no longer a monologue, to the extent that it ever was. It no longer is a monologue because people are able to assail you. And then also, there's we're talking about sort of journalistic sayings, right? The old saying, you never pick a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel, but now everybody buys ink by the barrel. Everybody has access to the public. Everybody has access to the ability to shape our perceptions of what's going on in the world. And for us as news consumers and as citizens and as participants in our society, really the challenge is trying to make sense of all of that and trying to sort of sift through all of that and then decide where we want to focus our attentions and our actions.
Absolutely. And Brian, I want to mention something to you, and this wasn't really planned. So I apologize for throwing this at you. But
I'll survive. Hit me.
okay, yeah, I know you're good. You can pivot. I know you have a close connection, or had with is it the Bingham family that were the family that ran the Courier Journal and the Louisville Times in Louisville. Now,
Yes.
one of the things I've always heard is, you know, uh, TV news at one time, both local and network, was not a money-making proposition. Now they ran commercials, and I'm sure they had income, um, but their goal was not to satisfy stockholders, and which has become an issue, right? And newspapers in most major markets, and even medium and even smaller markets, were family owned. Why did that matter? And why would a family decide to own something? Like, why did the Binghams want to own the paper if it wasn't a big money making profit center for them?
Well, papers did make money. They just didn't make outrageous amounts of it. And the Bingham family, Robert Worth Bingham, who consolidated the Morning Journal and the Courier to become the Courier Journal. Henry Watterson was one of his first editors, who was famously fired, but that's another story. Robert Worth had over the I remember walking in my first day of work at the Courier Journal and Louisville Times, and there over the elevators that went up to the fourth floor newsroom was this sign and this quote from Robert Worth Bingham. He said, "I have always thought of these newspapers as a public trust and have endeavored to operate them that way." I'm paraphrasing, but the idea was that we were there for the public, and it was through that you made the money. It was through the trust. It was through the idea that if you wanted facts, if you wanted to know information, you turned to the Courier Journal and Louisville Times. And thus, the Courier Journal and Louisville Times, and they owned WHAS as well for a long time. and they owned Standard Gravure, a printing company that printed the Courier until they divested themselves of it due to laws that were later repealed by Ronald Reagan, thus ruining journalism forever. But that's another story. But Robert Worth Bingham and the Bingham family felt that the idea was that you provide the best service you can do is to provide your people who are buying your newspaper and reading your newspaper. If you convince them, or not convince them, but if you provide them vetted factual information, that's the best way to conduct business. And thus they were able to enlarge. Their readership was huge, 300, 400,000. They had, when I was working in there at the height of the Bingham Empire, right before they sold it off to Gannett, they had bureaus. They had bureaus in Washington, D.C., staffed by 6 to 10 people. They had bureaus in the state legislature in Frankfort, Kentucky, staffed by a couple of dozen people. They had foreign bureaus. They had a bureau in London, I think, one in Moscow, another one in Japan. I can't remember all of them that they had, and then they partnered with other community newspapers like the Des Moines Register, I believe, and others that were privately owned and owned by families. And they partnered together to provide bureaus around the world and reporting around the world. So it was valuable because it was a valuable voice. And look, the Courier-Journal and Louisville Times was often pilloried for being liberal and too progressive in the state of Kentucky. And the Binghams were very wise in how they conducted their business. They let the Courier be the progressive morning newspaper, and they let the afternoon newspaper, the Louisville Times, be the staid, stoic one. So, it was pretty smart. So when people go, I'm not advertising in the Courier anymore, out of hell, I'll put it in the Louisville Times. So I'll teach them. And Barry's going, yeah, that's a good idea. Here we go. We still got money. But the idea was, and you know this, Mark, from being and growing up in Louisville, the Courier was so well regarded that the people who even hated the newspaper, politicians, loved to get the endorsement of the Courier-Journal when they ran for office. And the Courier vetted these people. And I was, part of the team that did some of the fact-finding and some of these, people running for office. If you want to get vetted before the Courier, there was background research done by a team of reporters. It was then given to a group of editors who made up an editorial board that interviewed the prospective political candidate, brought them on, asked them questions, and based on their answers, the Courier would endorse or not endorse them. We don't do any of that today, and it's no coincidence that shortly after the Courier was sold to Gannett, that the wonderful Mitch McConnell rose in stature in the state of Kentucky, unvetted, untrusted, unfounded to be of any use at all to anyone but himself. So the goal was, to make money, but they weren't so enamored of making, globs of sweaty cash. They knew they had what I liked about Barry Bingham Sr., and I met him, and God love him. I thought he was one of the best people I ever worked for. And he was a close friend at one point in time with H.L. Mencken. He valued the idea of independence. He valued the idea of vetted factual information, and he took it as a calling. And that's what journalism used to be at its best. At its worst, it's just a money-making proposition led to clickbait and making sure that, we go viral. And that's not what we're here for.
And I think we may, I'm going to talk about here some stuff that I think we're going to be doing. I mentioned briefly on the side here, where we're going to do some explainers or sidebars. When we have things like this to talk about that we may do separately, that's not about a particular story, but about like a media theory or things like this, where we're talking about the changes in media over time, particularly news media, and why that matters. So, Mike, as journalism professors, I think you and I can add these explainers about things like media theory, something like framing that we can talk about, but we can go into more detail about that in the sidebar. What do you think? Why would that matter? Why does it matter that people understand some of these things like media theory when it comes to choosing sources for getting media?
So I think everybody is a media theorist in some way, shape, or form. If you spend any moment on social media, right, you're always hearing like, oh, this site's biased. These guys don't know what they're talking about. Right? Everyone's a media theorist, right? But they don't really know what they mean by that. They don't really like when you're responding. I'm on Blue Sky, right? I gave up Twitter. I went to Blue Sky, right? And every day, the moment somebody is sharing a headline on Blue Sky, right? And yes, this headline shows, the New York Times is getting something wrong, right? Or the New York Times is not taking a threat seriously. But ultimately, right, what does one bad headline matter, right? And I think being able to understand that point, being able to speak knowledgeably, understanding sort of what the choices are for any one individual story versus maybe what the way that our news gets to us from a more holistic, systemic perspective, right? So, we talk about this, like Brian was talking about the soup just a minute ago, right? The White House briefing room, like that's a PR operation, right? That is an operation to share a story. I think as we talk through PR operations, as we talk through the ways that administrations try to shape perceptions, right? I think it's better to understand that than just to say, oh, everybody's sort of inherently and internally corrupt. No, there is a project going on, right? This is one of the things where I think I'm a little different than a lot of people who study media, is that I try not to be too immersed in theory. I try not to be too blanketed by theory, right? Theory matters, right? Theory is how we make sense of the data points in front of us. Theory is how we understand what we're seeing. But ultimately, right, a lot of theories sort of take concepts like power or like, other concepts like that and sort of turn them into things that kind of float above the world and operate independently of sort of how these systems come together. I think, one of the benefits I bring to students to the classroom is that I haven't been in the White House briefing room, right? But I have been in these press conferences, and I have sort of seen the ways that stuff operates on a practical level. Because ultimately, we need theory to explain what we're seeing, right? Ultimately, we have data points, but we need an overarching frame for that. We need an overarching way to connect that to like what's going on in the world. And that is the challenge, right? That's why we need to sort of understand what theory does, what theory says, right? And sort of where we see the limits of theory playing out. That's hopefully that's of some value to these discussions.
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
I think, Michael, you said something that I've tried to put in practice, and others, I think we subconsciously, or maybe unconsciously, knowing the press, put into practice on a daily basis, the idea of theory. And when you talk about theory, look, I think that journalism is basically the scientific method applied to communication. When we get it wrong, we correct ourselves. There are theories based upon when you walk out of the door to cover a story. I can't tell you the number of times I've walked out of the door at any place I've worked thinking the story was A, and it turned out to be B or C. You have to be adaptable to the facts as they present themselves. Vetted factual information, again, the coin of the realm. You have a theory going out. I'll give you a great example, one that landed me in jail. I walked out of the door. I got called at, actually 2 o'clock in the morning for a cop shooting in San Antonio, Texas. At that time, there had been 2 or 3 cops involved in shootings in like the last 2 or 3 weeks, and there was this fear that people were going after the cops. So I left the door thinking, oh my God, this poor cop got gunned down. Here's another case of it, because that was the only information I had. Then as I began to gather information, it didn't add up, and so things didn't. It turned out that the story was that these 2 kids were attacked by a cop who was speedballing at the time under cocaine and heroin, and had gone after these two kids, and they got in a scuffle with him, and he ended up getting shot with his own gun. So if I had gone out and only reported the story that we thought the story was at the beginning, that's when you're not being a journalist, you're being an advocate or a propagandist, or at worst, a fictional storyteller. The idea of being a reporter means you have a theory, a working theory going forward, and as the facts make themselves known to you, or as you search and find those facts, you further hone that story till you get as close to the bone as possible. Those vetted facts are then those vetted facts are those that lead to the narrative, not what you want the narrative to be, but what the facts dictate. So your working theory always changes as you uncover more facts.
Right.
And
And
actually-
what we're always trying to do is to make, sorry, Mark, I didn't
No, go
jump
ahead.
in. No, like
ahead.
what we're trying, you're right. So what we're trying to, it's sort of, that is the scientific method at root, right? That scientists find data points and then they put them into a story, right? And what happens is what Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, would say, there you start with a paradigm, and as the data points fit the paradigm, it's a working paradigm. But suddenly you start discovering data points that don't fit that paradigm, and if you're not willing to let that shift, right, let that that overarching understanding change, you are either committed to an old idea, right? Therefore, you're not collectively telling us that. You have to tell us what's happening, right? You're not making sense of the world. What you're doing is you're trying to bend facts to fit your preconceived story, as opposed to letting the facts take you where you're going. And so I think on the day-to-day work, that's what journalists are doing. I think the other question is sort of the social theory question, right? What do we want from journalism, right? What are journalists? Why does it matter that journalists are spending all of this time and all of this energy chasing down facts, right? What is the thing that journalism does for society that, it used to do unfettered? It used to have more power, but we still, I think none of us would be here if we didn't think it was valuable to have this discussion. But there is a social theory question, right? The dreaded word sociology, right? I don't want to get anyone in trouble by saying that.
Are you a socialist? Are you talking about socialism?
That's right. I'm talking about socialism, right? So sociologyism, right? But the point there is, like, how does this work? Like, why do we need journalism? Why do we think we need journalism as a society? What is it? You have all these reporters in DC, in the State House, in our press boxes. Why are we expending all of that effort, right? What do we get out of it? And why does society need that? Or does it need that? I think it does, but I'm biased, right? But like, why do we need that? That's sort of the broader question.
I think that's a scientific, evaluation of the facts. We do need this. We are social animals. We need to know how others, interact. That goes back to caveman times. The guy running in, I saw antelope, let's go kill. The guy who saw it, gathered, antelope over there, let's go. That we needed to know that. So it's the journalists are the witnesses to history, and we should be and to the events that are going on that other people want or need to know about. And they need to know, practically, all right, so sports, you want to know how, Detroit's doing against Green Bay. They're getting their butt whipped. You want to know that. So that's, I know I say that to Michael as the Green Bay Packer hater that he is. But here we are. You want to know how the game's going, right? That's a want. The need. Our government spends our money. How are they using that money? So that's why you need to cover everything from the PTA meeting to the neighborhood watch committee, to the city council, county council, state legislature, and finally the U.S. government, which takes the most amount of money from all of us. We all need to know how they're spending their money and what they're doing in our name, because we are attached to this. So that's why I get angry when people, go, well, these leaders, they've let us down. Well, folks, you're the leaders. We have met the enemy, and he is us. To quote Pogo, you need to sit down and understand. And most people, it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics are local. You don't really, the former Speaker of the House, who said that, and then he said, you really don't really pay attention until you understand how it affects you. So I would say that factually, that's accurate. And so it's not an opinion to say that, I think you're right on target, Michael, but I don't think I think that's just stating facts. We need to know.
Right. And I also say that, like, the the political system, as we have at least designed it, requires the consent of the governed. And people, you can't be a good steward. We can't be good stewards of our citizen responsibilities without information. Now, we're not blank slates, right? And I'm sure down the road, right, we'll talk about media bias and the way that, like, yeah, that's understood and sort of what biases are. Like, I'm sure believe me, I'm guessing that's going to come. If we're talking about media together, that's going to come up, right? But the question really is, do we know enough to make choices, right? If you want the person who's running your, we're the board, the people are the board of directors of this country, right? We hire these politicians, right? Our job is to hire them to do a job.
Right.
And fundamentally, what we want to learn from, people like Brian in the press room and people who are covering every other thing is whether the people who we've hired are doing a good job. And, one of the questions we have to ask is how much of the junking up of our media system, right, the system that's increasingly hybrid, where everybody's talking at the same time and talking over each other, how much of that is sort of distracting people from their role as sort of our board of directors style role, as opposed to our fan role, right? We become fans of specific politicians, specific parties.
How the hell anyone can become a fan of any politician is beyond me. I agree with H.L. Mencken. The only way to look at a politician is down, but that's just me.
Right. My favorite Mencken quote is, "Democracy is the theory that the public knows what it wants and deserves to get it good and hard."
Yeah.
I'll add one more thing as we're discussing it, and you guys may be able to correct me if I get any of my facts wrong here. It's this idea that media, when they're giving us the information, they're adding bias or whatever it is, their interpretation, and we would rather have that information directly from the source. The problem with that I use in classes as a reference point is years ago when I believe it was British Petroleum, BP, had an oil drilling rig blow up on them. Do you guys?
Deepwater Horizon.
Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah, Deepwater Horizon.
And when it blew up, they were already in the process of drilling a hole in the bottom of the ocean and to get oil to come up out of that hole that they were going to collect and make money off of. But when it blew up, the pipe that goes down into that hole had broken off. Okay. And oil was coming out of the hole that they had dug in the ocean floor. And BP, in order to try to fix that problem, they had sent down a submersible with a camera on it to give them live video of what was happening down there. And what they did was report back to the public in their daily or probably multiple times daily press conferences that they were holding. BP controlled that information, but the press wanted access to that video. And if I remember it correctly, they finally got it. I don't know if a judge ruled on that or what the exact story was there, but they finally got that. And when they showed the public what that video camera was seeing, everybody kind of freaked out. It was not just a little oil dribbling out. It was a massive gush of oil going into the ocean. So this is why we need media to hold people accountable, because we can't just rely on those sources of that information that they're controlling to give us all the right stuff. So that would be my lesson on why it matters to have press covering stories like policy and politicians and not just accepting it from the social media that they're putting out. Okay. One other thing that I hope we can bring in whenever possible is experts as guests here, because while we may be, Brian is our expert on journalism and on White House press coverage, and Mike and I should be experts on how to teach journalists how to work. And as former working journalists ourselves, how our process worked, we want to bring in some people. And an example I think would be right now, a lot of people are trying to say what is and is not constitutional. So we might hopefully have somebody that's a constitutional lawyer or an expert on that
I would
to
recommend
bring in.
Jamie Raskin for that.
Okay.
Jamie's a great guy.
Well, tell me, Brian, you have a lot of connections. Talk about what we can do when it comes to bringing guests into our program.
Well, I think that's easy enough. When you're talking about journalism, Jamie Raskin, of course, has introduced the National Shield Law on a couple of occasions, as well in tune with what journalists need, want, and desire. And he is a constitutional scholar and would bring a great voice to that discussion. And there are others, depending on what the topic is as it relates to journalism. There are members of government who are well aware. Adam Schiff is one. Eric Swalwell is one. There are others that are available. And I'll tell you this, Sam Donaldson is one. These people who have the experience of either going through it on either side of the fence and can tell you where the pitfalls are and how we need to work together. Because at the end of the day, look, what you're talking about, for this government to work correctly, there is the way it was designed with the press is we are the irritant in the machinery. We are the fly in the ointment as designed to question what goes on. And those in politics who understand that are on the right side of history. Those in reporting who understand that will be on the right side of history. And we need to highlight how our not only the competition for facts, but our consternation with politicians is built into the system and is a good thing. Disagreeing with one another is not a bad thing. Politicians used to say it was the art of half a loaf. Now it's gimme all or gimme nothing. It's an all or nothing. It's a zero-sum game. And that's got to change. And the Constitution, and Jamie can speak to that, and the other constitutional scholars and people I've worked with. Mark Zaid is another great guy, a lawyer in D.C. who does this stuff, that can highlight where it is and why it is we are the way we are and how we can get back to the way we should be, because we're really far away from that. And to your point, Mark, both of you made this point, but there was a time when I stood in that briefing room and I was admonished, you don't give your opinion on the politicians, you ask questions. And the other day, there was a photographer in the press briefing room, in the Brady briefing room, who openly cheered for the President of the United States to run for another 4 years in 2028. This would never fly. Doesn't matter if I'd like Republicans to put the shoe on the other foot. There will be a time when a Democrat will be back in the executive office, or someone who's not a member of MAGA or a Republican. And would you stand for his party having someone in that briefing room cheering him on, not asking a hard question, but indulging his every fantasy? That's why the press has to be, the gears don't mesh for a reason. We're there to make sure that what they say are facts. And that means that we are going to be an irritant, but that's a good thing. Democracy, as they've said, many people far better than I, it's a messy proposition, but that's the way it works. Everyone is heard. I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it. And then let the people vote, and we follow the vote. The majority wins. Minorities have rights. Majority wins. And you cannot affect a good outcome or a democratic outcome with mis or disinformation, which is why the reporters are important in the process. All the way from, as I said, from covering Little League sports to the President of the United States. That's just the way it is. And so there are many people who can add to your discussion, Mark, and I appreciate you having me here and us having this discussion. This is the most, I think, as a reporter, the most important discussion to be having going forward. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And how do we do it? Or if you prefer, who, what, when, where, how, why. I don't know where we come up with that.
I don't know.
Nice original. That's a nice original. Had Have you copyrighted that one? That's pretty original there.
Well, it originated at the University of Missouri.
Oh, please.
Oh,
Please.
no.
All right. We've gone on way longer than I thought we would. But that's one of the benefits of getting three people who know a lot of stuff about these things is we tend to go on. And hopefully what we're going on about is information that people can use in order to better understand this stuff. Brian, this is not your only podcast or content that you create. You want to give yourself a brief plug here for some other stuff?
Sure.
That you do?
Let's see. The podcast, we have two. It's called Just Ask the Question, now in its 7th year, and Just Ask the Press, which is a weekly review of the news on every Sunday and Monday. And wherever fine podcasts are sold, you can catch me at it's salon.com weekly with a column, and the name of the book is called Free the Press. And then you can, like I said, catch me on a variety of different shows during the week, wherever, television or TV or live streaming or all that crap is available.
Wherever they'll let you on, apparently, is where.
Yes, that's right.
Which is not.
that guy.
Which it feels like lately it's not a lot of places. I don't know what's going on, Brian, but.
Who'd I piss off now?
Yeah. Michael, anything else you would like to add to this discussion before we call it a day?
So I guess you can find my work in various paywalled academic journals, and you can also find me on Blue Sky at michaelmirer.bsky.social or whatever it is.
And that's Mirer.
Mirer, yes.
All right, excellent. So go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Brad.
I meant to say this earlier. Michael, you reminded me of it. As an editor, and Mark, you reminded me of this too. As an editor, I oftentimes had reporters come up to me and go, "Hey, this is what I think," and I told them, "I don't give a shit what you think. I barely care what I think. What do you know?" That's journalism. So there's my bottom line.
What you know, it's what you know. Absolutely. All right, excellent. So that's what Hard Pass and this team hope to bring you, the listener or the viewer. We'd like you to hit the like and subscribe, the general stuff with podcasts. You won't want to miss out on any of this content. If there's a story that you would like us to analyze, let us know on Threads or Instagram. You can find us at, and now this is all one word, Hard Pass Podcast. Again, one word, Hard Pass Podcast on Instagram and Threads. We hope to hear from you. Thanks for joining us. And until next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Hard Pass, an analysis of press coverage of the top political story of the day. Hit the like and subscribe, and please join us next time. I'm Fiona. Thanks from the whole team at Hard Pass. Bye-bye.